Welcome to the Trackpads Military History Podcast, where we bring the terrain, the tactics, and the stories of soldiers to life. Each episode goes deeper than the written article, giving you a front-row seat to the battles that shaped history. Discover more at trackpads.com.
The spring of 1944 settled over England with a strange tension, a mixture of calm countryside and the heavy pulse of war. Villages across Kent and Sussex seemed alive with the presence of armies. Yet the armies were, in large part, illusions. Soldiers hammered tent stakes into fields, trucks rumbled along narrow roads, and tank tracks gouged the earth. Yet many of the tanks themselves were little more than air-filled rubber shells. Airfields appeared crowded with fighters and bombers, but closer inspection revealed wooden frames with painted markings, designed to fool the eye from 1,000 feet. Even sprawling depots of fuel drums, glistening under camouflage nets, held nothing but emptiness. This elaborate theater, visible to German reconnaissance aircraft and reported back to Berlin, told a convincing story of an invasion force preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. What the enemy saw was not a genuine army but a masterfully constructed deception. Operation Fortitude, a weapon woven not from steel and explosives, but from appearance, rumor, and calculated lies. Behind this carefully staged performance lay a gamble as serious as any in the war. The Allies knew that the Normandy landings, when they came, would test the fragile balance between surprise and destruction. The beaches themselves were vulnerable, hemmed by seawalls, overlooked by bunkers, and easily threatened by swift counterattack. If Hitler's armored divisions were hurled against those beaches in the first days, the invasion could collapse before it found footing. Fortitude existed to prevent that outcome. Its goal was not simply to distract, but to paralyze, to hold German reserves in place at Calais, while the real invasion unfolded to the west. Each day of hesitation bought through deception would allow engineers to clear minefields, infantry to dig in, and artillery to roll ashore. In a campaign where time was the most critical commodity, the illusion of Calais was designed to purchase it in abundance. The brilliance of Fortitude lay in its use of German certainty against itself. To the minds of Hitler's generals, the Pas-de-Calais was the only logical target. It was the shortest crossing, the most direct path into Germany, and the most heavily fortified sector of the Atlantic Wall. Rather than contradicting these assumptions, Allied planners leaned into them, feeding the Germans with clues, reports, and images that confirmed what they already expected to be true. The Germans did not need to be convinced of a new reality. They needed only to be reassured of their existing belief. By amplifying that expectation until it drowned out all doubts about Normandy, the Allies transformed a geographical assumption into a strategic prison. This is not a tale told in the thunder of artillery or the clash of armor, but in subtler tones. The steady pulse of false radio signals echoing across the airwaves, the carefully drafted reports of double agents delivering tidbits of gossip, and the silhouettes of phantom aircraft standing quiet on lonely airstrips. It is a story of discipline, where clerks forged paperwork with the same dedication as infantrymen dug trenches, and carpenters crafted wooden guns with the seriousness of engineers building bridges. It is also a story of courage, for sailors and airmen carried out feints under the risk of real gunfire, and agents lived double lives under constant suspicion. To understand D-Day fully, one must look beyond the sand and seawalls of Normandy to the shadows cast across the Channel. Operation Fortitude was the silent artillery barrage of the campaign, shaping the tempo of battle by shaping the enemy's mind and buying the Allies the most precious of all wartime resources, time itself. The problem the Allies faced in 1944 was rooted in geography as much as in strategy. To the German High Command, the Pas-de-Calais was the natural invasion site. It was the narrowest point of the English Channel, the most direct route from Britain into northern France, and home to long, flat beaches that seemed made for the landing of tanks and supplies. Heavy batteries lined its coast, and efficient railway lines linked the region straight back into Germany. All the logic of terrain and logistics pointed to Calais. In Berlin's war rooms, this certainty became doctrine, a conclusion so obvious it blinded them to alternatives. For the Allies, that certainty was the opening. Normandy, though less favorable in terms of direct routes and terrain, was weaker in fortification, offering the chance for surprise. If only they could make the Germans keep staring at Calais, they could seize Normandy before the enemy understood what was happening. Normandy itself was no easy prize. Its coastline was less forgiving, marked by seawalls, tidal flats, and behind them the hedgerow country. A patchwork of small fields, sunken lanes, and earthen banks that formed natural fortresses for defenders. The invasion required a longer sea crossing, and the logistical path inland was more complex than at Calais. Yet these very disadvantages were its strength. German defenses were thinner there, their fortifications less elaborate, their artillery less concentrated. The risk lay not in the landing, but in what came after. If panzer divisions, held in reserve, were allowed to strike quickly and in force, the fragile beachhead could be rolled up before the Allies built depth. Everything depended on shaping German perception so that they hesitated to commit those reserves. The Allies had to make Normandy appear as the feint and Calais as the inevitable blow. That task was complicated by the fractured nature of German command. Hitler retained personal authority over the release of armored reserves, creating a bottleneck that slowed response. Beneath him, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel clashed over doctrine. Rundstedt favored holding armor back to deliver a crushing counterstroke once the true invasion site was revealed. Rommel, by contrast, argued for placing reserves close to the coast, to smash landings before they could gather strength. The tension between these schools of thought created fertile ground for deception. If the Germans believed Calais was the main target, Rundstedt's logic would prevail, delaying the release of reserves to Normandy. If Rommel's urgency was diluted by Hitler's indecision, precious days would be lost. Fortitude aimed to amplify these disagreements, ensuring paralysis rather than swift reaction. The Allies also possessed a secret advantage that turned deception into an art of feedback. Through Ultra, they read intercepted German signals and could see in near real time what Berlin believed. This meant Fortitude was never static. It evolved like a dialogue. When double agents reported troop concentrations in Kent, Ultra confirmed German analysts accepted the story. When doubts arose about Normandy, deception planners responded with new signals, false convoys, or fresh gossip to reinforce the Calais narrative. It was a rare luxury in war to watch the enemy's thought process unfold and adjust accordingly. Geography created the problem, but intelligence provided the lever. By weaponizing terrain certainty and harnessing command friction, Fortitude transformed German logic into German paralysis. The stakes could not have been higher. Without Fortitude, German armored divisions might have been unleashed within hours of the landings, rolling across open fields to strike men still wading through surf and sand. Instead, those divisions lingered under orders to wait. Their commanders told the real battle was still to come. Every moment of hesitation was a gift to the Allies' time to clear obstacles, move supplies, and dig defenses. The problem Fortitude had to solve was not just convincing the Germans of a lie. It was giving the truth in Normandy the chance to harden into something immovable. In that sense, the deception was not an accessory to D-Day. It was the invisible shield that made D-Day possible. The creation of the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, was perhaps the boldest stroke of the entire deception. On paper, it was a formidable force, complete with divisions, corps, and support units, all neatly charted on organizational diagrams and referenced in forged paperwork. Headquarters circulated orders, drafted reports, and even maintained files on units that had no flesh-and-blood soldiers. To German intelligence, the paperwork was indistinguishable from reality. The Phantom Army had an administrative heartbeat, and that heartbeat resonated across the channel in signals traffic, aerial reconnaissance photos, and agent reports. It was a conjuring act conducted not by magicians, but by staff officers, clerks, and signalers who knew that every forged requisition or scripted radio message might one day be weighed against Allied lives on a French beach. If the paperwork gave FUSAG substance, General George S. Patton gave it soul. To the Germans, Patton was the embodiment of American aggression, a commander who had smashed through North Africa and Sicily with an energy that bordered on reckless. When they learned he had been given command of the supposed army massing near Dover, it confirmed their expectations. Allied planners knew this and made him visible at just the right times, inspecting troops, delivering speeches, or touring airfields. Each appearance was carefully calculated, designed to be seen, heard, or whispered about. Patton himself became a weapon, his reputation radiating credibility over an army that did not exist. To Berlin, the logic was inescapable. Where Patton was, the main blow must follow. But paper and personality were only part of the illusion. Soldiers of camouflage units and engineers set to work creating the physical fabric of the deception. Inflatable tanks, crafted of rubber and canvas, were positioned under camouflage nets where German reconnaissance planes could not miss them. Wooden aircraft were built with such care that from a distance they cast shadows indistinguishable from real machines. Dummy landing craft dotted harbors, their profiles convincing enough to suggest entire fleets. Even fuel pipelines were assembled in fields, their painted lengths coiled convincingly beside false pumping stations. Each artifact was designed not to withstand close inspection, but to be glimpsed from afar, filed into enemy intelligence reports, and folded into the larger narrative. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and it transformed Kent and Sussex into a stage where appearance was as valuable as reality. Supporting these illusions was a theater of logistics. Convoys of vehicles rumbled along roads on carefully planned circuits to create traffic patterns consistent with massing divisions. Drivers were ordered to obey strict blackout rules and timed routes, ensuring that movement looked authentic but remained under control. Supply depots were erected with meticulous attention to aerial visibility, rows of tents, stacks of crates, and fields of fuel drums aligned in ways that would photograph convincingly. Road intersections were managed with the precision of stagecraft, soldiers ensuring tire marks accumulated in the right places. From above, it all looked like an army on the move. For the men tasked with maintaining the illusion, it was an odd war driving in circles, hammering together props and painting shadows. Yet the weight of their labor was real. Each convincing sign meant another day of German hesitation, another chance for the real invasion force to carve its foothold into Normandy. Life in this landscape of illusions created a curious atmosphere for the soldiers stationed there. They trained as usual, but often their exercises were more performance than preparation. Infantry drilled beside dummy tanks and mechanics serviced aircraft that could never fly. Conversations were staged in public houses, where German agents might listen, and local civilians became unknowing actors in the grand play. It was soldiering of a peculiar sort, one that required patience, craftsmanship, and an unusual awareness of being observed. For many, the strangest part of the deception was the knowledge that their daily routine mundane tasks like driving, hammering, or gossiping was shaping the enemy's perception of reality. In the grand chessboard of war, they were pawns who disguised themselves as queens, and their success was measured not in territory gained, but in illusions sustained. The true heart of Fortitude lay not only in inflatable tanks and dummy airfields, but in the whispered network of agents and signals that made the illusion breathe. At the center of this system was Britain's XX Committee, which had painstakingly turned captured or willing German spies into double agents. Their greatest asset was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, who spun an entire web of fictitious sub-agents across Britain. To Berlin, his reports read as authentic mundane details about weather, troop movements, and soldier complaints, woven together with just enough errors to appear genuine. Each small lie reinforced a larger fiction, that the Allies were massing for a strike at Calais. Garbo's credibility became a linchpin of the deception, his steady stream of letters and radio messages confirming what German analysts already believed. Radio discipline gave the Phantom Army its pulse. Specialist units maintained elaborate wireless networks, generating the chatter of a formation that did not exist. Operators followed scripts with the precision of actors, simulating the rhythms of an army on the march, supply requests, weather updates, and minor miscommunications. These details mattered because they reflected the reality of military life. An authentic army never operated seamlessly. German signals intelligence listened, logged, and charted this artificial heartbeat, seeing in the volume and cadence the unmistakable signs of a large force preparing for action. What they could not see was that the messages came from a handful of operators in isolated huts, carefully following pre-planned schedules. Fortitude also exploited the bureaucratic habits of military organizations. Deception units created paperwork trails, supply manifests, training orders, casualty lists. That painted a picture of life within FUSAG. Some of these documents were allowed to leak through diplomatic channels or neutral intermediaries, feeding tidbits to Berlin that aligned with the larger narrative. To German analysts who thrived on reconciling multiple sources, the consistency was compelling. Every report, every photograph, every intercepted message reinforced the same conclusion. A powerful army stood ready opposite Calais. The more evidence accumulated, the harder it became to question. Bureaucracy itself became a weapon, suffocating doubt beneath a mountain of administrative detail. What made this whisper web so effective was the feedback loop provided by Ultra. By reading German communications, the Allies could see how their lies were being received. If Berlin showed skepticism about Normandy, deception planners responded with fresh reports or additional wireless traffic to strengthen belief in Calais. If German agents pressed for confirmation, new proof was staged and fed through Garbo or others. This made Fortitude an adaptive operation, constantly adjusting to enemy perceptions. Deception was not static. It was iterative, a dialogue conducted across airwaves and intelligence reports. The Allies weren't simply lying. They were managing the enemy's understanding of reality in real time. For those tasked with carrying out this deception, the work was demanding and oddly anonymous. Radio operators endured long watches, tapping out meaningless chatter with the same focus as men sending real orders. Clerks filled endless pages of forged rosters, manifests, and schedules, knowing they would never leave the filing cabinets except through the eyes of enemy intelligence. Double agents lived precarious lives, balancing loyalty to Britain against the constant risk of exposure by their German handlers. Their contribution would never be marked by medals or parades, but without them, the great illusion could not stand. Together they formed the Whisper Web, a network as intricate as any battlefield formation, whose victories were measured not in captured ground but in stolen time. On the night of the 5th to the 6th of June 1944, the English Channel transformed into a stage for one of history's most elaborate performances. Along carefully plotted routes, flotillas of small motor launches crept forward, their engines thudding softly against the chop. These craft were no invasion fleet, yet their orders carried immense weight. They were to impersonate one. Sailors tossed bundles of metallic foil, known as window, into the night air at exact intervals, creating shimmering clouds that drifted on the wind. To German radar operators watching their Würzburg and Freya screens, those foil clouds reflected signals identical to those of a convoy. Towed reflectors enhanced the illusion, producing steady echoes that seemed to hold formation. For the men in coastal bunkers, the picture was unmistakable. Their scopes bloomed with blips advancing toward Pas de Calais, just as intelligence had predicted for months. What looked like the prelude to invasion was, in truth, little more than strips of foil and a handful of launches playing their part in the grand deception. The mirage extended beyond radar returns. Allied planners understood that a convincing story needed multiple layers: sound, sight, and behavior, all reinforcing one another. Naval detachments set up false navigation lights, blinking in patterns that suggested channels had been cleared for approaching vessels. Elsewhere, destroyers and smaller warships fired occasional shells toward the coast. The impacts were few, spaced deliberately, like the ranging shots of a battleship preparing for bombardment. German spotters peering into the night saw flashes on the horizon, heard the dull boom of naval guns, and reported what their instruments confirmed. A fleet stood offshore. For the defenders of Calais, everything aligned. Radar screens showed massed shipping, navigation beacons winked in the darkness, and artillery fire rumbled across the sea. It was a coherent narrative, and coherence is what makes illusions most dangerous. Nature itself collaborated in the deception. The Channel's weather that night was poor enough to frustrate visual confirmation, but clear enough for trained Allied crews to execute their tasks. Low clouds smeared the sky, drizzle misted across observation posts, and the sea heaved with a stiff swell. In such conditions, German commanders placed even greater trust in radar returns, the very domain where the Allies' trickery was strongest. The rough seas also concealed the small size of the launches, their erratic movements blending into the chaos of waves. From the French cliffs, the horizon was nothing but shifting shadows, and in those shadows the illusion of a vast fleet seemed entirely plausible. What might have looked suspicious under calm skies instead became credible under the cloak of storm. Fortitude's planners had gambled that marginal weather would strengthen their ruse, and the gamble paid off. The deception was bolstered by months of careful stage setting from the air. Before D-Day, Allied reconnaissance flights had allowed the Germans to capture photographs of dummy landing craft moored in British estuaries, supply dumps swelling near Dover, and busy roads choked with traffic. These images built expectations that on the 6th of June found supposed confirmation in the radar illusions. As bombers flew that night, they dropped additional curtains of window, creating corridors of radar clutter that resembled whole columns of ships moving toward the coast. German analysts, conditioned to see Calais as the focal point of invasion, interpreted the radar picture as proof of what their photographs had already suggested. Each piece of evidence, false though it was, seemed to corroborate the others. This layering of lies, visual, auditory, and electromagnetic, made disbelief harder than belief. For the men who carried out these operations, the experience was both tense and surreal. Sailors steering fragile launches operated within range of powerful coastal guns, knowing a single misstep could expose them to annihilation. Their mission was not to fight but to pretend, holding courses, scattering foil, and flashing beacons that painted them as targets for an invasion that did not exist. Pilots flying chaff runs maintained predictable headings at low altitude, exposing themselves to flak in order to preserve the timing of the illusion. Naval crews who fired ranging shells had to balance aggression with restraint, never escalating enough to invite retaliation, but loud enough to be noticed. These were acts of courage measured in patience and precision rather than violence. By dawn, the dangerous masquerade had succeeded. German commanders remained fixated on Calais, convinced an armada was bearing down on them, even as the real invasion was unfolding far to the southwest. The phantom fleets had achieved their purpose. They bought the Allies time, and with it, the chance to turn Normandy's beaches into a foothold for liberation. When dawn broke on the 6th of June, German situation maps told a story written as much in illusion as in fact. Normandy was aflame with landings, yet across the Channel, radar screens and agent reports still pointed to Calais. The German 15th Army, responsible for guarding the strait, remained poised for the main blow they were certain would follow. Orders from higher headquarters reinforced that belief, instructing units to hold in readiness rather than rush south. The effect was paralysis disguised as caution. Hitler's insistence on personally releasing armored reserves meant that decisions funneled upward through layers of command, each step slowed by the conviction that the real invasion had not yet begun. Every hour that ticked by without action gave Allied engineers time to clear obstacles, establish supply dumps, and push infantry off the sand. Normandy, so fragile in its first moments, began to harden into something more durable, because German certainty anchored their strongest forces to the wrong beaches. The friction inside German command only deepened the paralysis. Field Marshal Rommel argued that only an immediate, violent counterattack could throw the Allies back into the sea. But he was away visiting Germany when the landings began. Rundstedt, by contrast, favored holding reserves inland, waiting to strike only when the Schwerpunkt became clear. Fortitude ensured that clarity never came. German staff officers clung to the belief that Normandy was a diversion, a trap designed to lure their armor too soon. Messages from frontline units reporting the scale of Allied landings were treated as local exaggerations, anomalies to be smoothed out once the true invasion unfolded at Calais. What might have been healthy skepticism turned into dangerous rigidity. In the vital 48 hours after the landings, tanks that could have devastated the beachhead remained idle, while Allied units expanded their lodgements. For the soldiers of the 15th Army, the waiting was its own battle. Tank crews tuned engines daily, ready to drive south at a moment's notice, while infantry drilled embarkation plans for a counteroffensive that never came. Scouts kept watch along the dikes and beaches of Calais, peering across a channel horizon that stubbornly refused to deliver the fleet they had been warned about for months. Their terrain seemed perfectly suited to repel an invasion: wide fields, prepared bunkers, and interlocking gun positions. But in Normandy, the real fight unfolded amid hedgerows and narrow lanes, where German defenders fought with ferocity, yet without the reserves that might have tipped the balance. The soldiers waiting in Calais became spectators, their strength neutralized not by combat, but by deception. To them, the war felt like a cruel trick. They were prepared for a decisive battle, but it never came to their ground. Even when orders finally arrived to release reserves, the delays proved fatal. Allied air supremacy made movement south a gauntlet of destruction. Bridges were destroyed, roads clogged with refugees and supply columns, and fighter-bombers roamed the skies, pouncing on any movement by daylight. Tanks crawled forward in small groups, their strength dissipated before it could be massed. By the time significant German armor reached the Normandy front, the Allies had secured beachheads, linked them together, and seeded the countryside with artillery observers and minefields. What might have been a decisive counterstroke became piecemeal assaults, each beaten back with heavy losses. The opportunity to smash the invasion on the beaches had evaporated in the fog of indecision, sacrificed on the altar of belief in Calais. The cost of this fixation was measured not just in missed opportunities, but in the campaign's trajectory. For weeks after D-Day, German high command remained convinced a second, larger landing at Calais was imminent. Even as Allied forces pushed inland, commanders held back formations in the north, reluctant to commit them until the phantom blow fell. This lingering hesitation drained strength from the real battlefield, ensuring that when the Allies launched their breakout at St. Lo and later Operation Cobra, the German defense lacked the reserves it needed. Fortitude had not destroyed a single tank or silenced a single gun, but it had done something just as decisive. It denied the enemy the chance to fight where and when it mattered. In that denial lay the true measure of its success. By mid-June, the results of Fortitude were visible not in what the Germans did, but in what they failed to do. Each day of hesitation meant the Allies were expanding their grip on Normandy. Engineers laid down temporary roads over the beaches, cleared minefields, and built depots for ammunition and fuel. Infantry battalions pushed inland, establishing defensive lines and securing villages, while artillery units registered fields of fire to blunt any armored thrust. What had begun as a tenuous foothold was rapidly hardening into a fortress. The deception at Calais bought this time. German armored divisions that might have broken the invasion within hours remained tethered to the wrong coast, convinced their moment of glory had yet to arrive. By the time they moved, the battlefield had changed, and the Allies were ready for them. When German armor did arrive in Normandy, it was too little and too late. Columns moved under skies dominated by Allied aircraft, suffering heavy losses on the roads. Bridges were destroyed by bombing raids, forcing tanks onto narrow diversion routes that slowed progress to a crawl. Supply lines faltered, with fuel convoys harried by fighter bombers and artillery. Instead of arriving as a concentrated fist, the German counterattacks trickled in piecemeal, striking prepared positions where Allied defenses were strongest. Infantry dug into hedgerows, artillery observers tied to naval guns, and anti-tank crews waited in ambush along sunken lanes. The decisive counterblow that Rommel had feared was smothered before it could land. Fortitude had ensured that the timing favored the Allies, turning German might into a series of exhausted gestures. Yet, the most remarkable achievement of the deception was its persistence. Weeks after the initial landings, German High Command continued to insist that Normandy was only the opening act. Reports from double agents, carefully curated by British handlers, maintained the fiction that Patton's first U.S. Army group was still massing in Kent. Each new chaff drop or feigned radio transmission reinforced the idea that the real invasion was still to come at Calais. Even as Allied armies fought their way inland, Hitler and his commanders kept strong formations in the north, unwilling to risk committing them until the phantom blow fell. This fixation was more than stubbornness. It was the result of a narrative so consistent and so convincing that to abandon it would have required admitting they had been deceived from the beginning. The consequences of that lingering belief were profound. By the time the Germans finally began to shift their reserves, Normandy had become a bastion bristling with men and firepower. Ports were functioning, supply chains were established, and Allied offensives were beginning to probe deeper into France. The 15th Army's continued idleness in Calais left the German front starved of strength. When the Allies broke out at Saint-Lô and launched Operation Cobra in late July, they faced a defense brittle and exhausted, unable to withstand the assault. The absence of reserves was not simply a tactical oversight, it was the direct harvest of Fortitude's deception. Every day those units waited in the wrong place, the Allies gained momentum they would never relinquish. Fortitude's power was its ability to act like silent artillery, shaping the battlefield without firing a shot. Where bombardments shatter defenses with shock, deception bends the enemy's mind until hesitation becomes paralysis. In Normandy, that paralysis translated into time. Time to dig, time to build, time to prepare. It gave the Allies the cushion they needed to turn a risky gamble into a launching pad for liberation. When historians measure the weight of deception, they often count the panzers withheld, the reserves delayed, the hours lost. But its true effect was less tangible. It changed the rhythm of the campaign, ensuring that when battles came, they were fought on Allied terms. In this sense, Fortitude was as decisive as any beach assault, a weapon made of shadows that proved every bit as lethal as steel. In the end, Operation Fortitude was not simply a sideshow to D-Day, but a decisive instrument in its success. Its greatest achievement was to make the Germans believe what they already thought they knew. By reinforcing their conviction that Calais was the inevitable invasion site, the Allies transformed German certainty into a trap. The deception chained the 15th Army to the wrong ground, kept panzer reserves idle at the decisive moment, and gave the fragile Normandy lodgements the breathing room they needed. What appeared to German commanders as prudence, waiting for the main blow, was in reality paralysis, engineered by a campaign of shadows. Fortitude's triumph lay in the absence of enemy action when it mattered most. But deception was never without cost or risk. Double agents lived on the edge of exposure, feeding their German handlers just enough truth to remain trusted. Sailors and pilots carrying out radar illusions worked within range of coastal batteries, where discovery could mean annihilation. Radio operators, clerks, and camouflage units labored in obscurity, knowing their contribution would never be measured in captured cities or battlefield glory. Ethical questions hung over the enterprise, too. Lies were carefully sewn into diplomatic channels, and some information was manipulated at the expense of individuals whose safety could not be guaranteed. Yet in the brutal arithmetic of war, these risks and sacrifices bought survival for thousands who might otherwise have been swept away in the surf of Normandy. The enduring lesson of Fortitude is that deception, when executed with discipline and creativity, can wield strategic power equal to armies in the field. Its principles remain timeless. Build your story on the logic of terrain and enemy expectation. Synchronize every element agents, signals, visual cues, so the lie feels seamless, and reinforce it until disbelief becomes more dangerous than belief. The Germans were not fools. They were professionals who saw what their instruments, maps, and agents told them to see. By curating those inputs, the Allies directed German decisions without ever engaging them directly. In so doing, They demonstrated that the battlefield is as much a contest of perception as of firepower. Modern warfare continues to echo Fortitude's example. Today, false electronic signatures, cyber spoofing, and information operations replicate the same principles in digital form. Just as rubber tanks and chaff curtains convinced the Wehrmacht, so too can manipulated data and artificial traffic sway the decisions of 21st century commanders. The tools have changed, but the vulnerabilities of human belief remain constant. Operation Fortitude reminds us that certainty can be the most fragile position of all. In June 1944, that fragility was exploited to win time, and time became victory. It is a legacy of deception, not measured in explosions or blood, but in silence. In the absence of enemy divisions at the beaches where they were most desperately needed.
Thank you for joining us on the Trackpads Military History Podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the battlefield, be sure to explore more articles, episodes, and series at trackpads.com.